So Nathaniel, on the point of the importance of narratives, are
Yes.
there any good government narratives?
Are there any good... so we don't work with political parties, we work with governments. Politics does them very well. I think politics have always been good at... Yes, there are. I forgot our company has made a very good narrative for government. Things like public health initiatives are very often quite well researched, based in science and understanding about how to change knowledge or behaviours. So the separate part of our agency, I wasn't involved, but does UK's public health initiative called Change for Life, and they looked at how they could tackle obesity, and it's been going a decade, and it's had a tremendous impact by, for example, not blaming parents, but by blaming modern life and saying modern life is difficult for us all. Not saying fat people, but fat in the body, etc. So I think the governments that are working with the private sector are creating some good campaigns for something. Anti-smoking, you've probably seen good anti-smoking ads, so yeah.
So the most popular government agency in Sweden is, what would you guess?
Most popular government agency? Health service?
It's a tax agency. And the tax agency...
What a crazy country.
And the tax agency, when you talk to them, they say that the way that they manage to accomplish this is not by communicating a narrative, but by acting a narrative.
Okay. Yeah.
Would you say that, because of course we're in the business of strategic communication, saying that everything communicates, how would you balance that when it comes to communicating a narrative? I mean, balancing acting and communicating, if there is such a balance game.
So we touched on it briefly. Like, communications is a relatively weak force. And so communications can shift perception where there is a grayscale. You can make people like things more than they did. What has a real impact is what's going on the ground. Like, we can't run communications in a war zone saying everything's fine. Nobody will believe you. Equally, so if you buy a BMW, the thing that's going to drive your liking of that BMW is going to be way more about the driving than some TV ad we've knocked out. Do you know what I mean? So I think it's fundamental. Yeah, the reality plays a massive role, and then the communications is good at kind of framing that. So I would suggest they should keep advertising how much people like them.
Great. It's Nathaniel Hill. He's the head of strategy for MC Saatchi. He works in security, defense, and the diplomacy sectors of MC Saatchi. And you're also responsible, I read, for making sure that your products actually change people's behaviors and attitudes. So a very big task. But what you'll talk about today, if I've understood this correctly, is the importance of long-term narrative. So the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I'm glad we got onto Cambridge Analytica. I'm surprised it took us so long. I was asked to talk about micro-targeting, so I will. But it reminded me of a conversation I had with my dad about Cambridge Analytica, because he hadn't been that well, and we were driving to our sort of ancestral village and having a bit of a heart-to-heart. And my dad was worried. He was looking at the news about Cambridge Analytica, and he was reading the paper about everything going on. And I think he was worried about me as well. And he said, you know, Nathaniel, do you use these techniques? And I looked him in the eye and I said, of course I do. It's my day job. I use it all the time. It's a fundamental part of how we work. So I think what's going on there, and the reason Dad was worried, is that we are conflating too many things. I think Cambridge Analytica has become sort of this mystic technique and this mystic sort of approach that somehow is changing the world. And I'm always cautious when I see things like that. Now, don't get me wrong. They behaved unethically with messaging, and they also behaved illegally with data. So I'm not condoning that. But what I'm saying is that we have to look at micro-targeting objectively and ask what it does and what can it do, and ideally by using some sort of empirical evidence. And I haven't seen any. I haven't seen any empirical evidence that showed the role Cambridge Analytica took in the Trump election, nor have I seen any in the Brexit election. So I've read books about people who are involved and looking for a new job, about how they changed the paradigm. What I haven't seen is any evidence. So I think we should look at that. What I have seen, actually, though, is a very slim majority. Both those votes were very, very slim majorities. And I think, certainly from the UK, I know what else has been going on. And at the time, the Brexit election, 52% voted to leave. That's after 3 decades of the press, the popular press, bashing the EU. It's after a decade of austerity where people were struggling to survive and struggling to live and cutbacks to social services and all those kinds of things. And so I really struggle to think that this new technique delivered all of this change when, why does Rupert Murdoch not get any credit when Cambridge Analytica do? So what I want to look at that, and with all these changes, we are in a period of change. I'm not here to say that digital isn't increasing. Everyone's increasing their investment. But what I think we should do is look at what role it plays, what value it is, and how best to deploy it. Because I'm sort of old enough to remember, when VHSs came out, everyone predicted the death of cinema. Because why go to the cinema when you can sit at home eating popcorn in your pants? And of course, cinema is doing better than ever, and guess where VHS is? So we should take these moments to look and define what role things will take in our communications. So I will look from a commercial point of view and from a political point of view. I know more about the commercial world. I'll suggest some implications for information operations. I'll tell you a bit about what I do in a second. I have a couple of appeals along the way, which I think are right, but I would love people to disprove them. And then I've got a hypothesis which is grounded on no evidence, but might be interesting to talk about. So I've spent 20 years in commercial advertising, and I worked with big brands like Microsoft and Google, and I served my time on Everyone Has to Do a Breakfast cereal for a while. I did a bit of pet food. They were good times. But since then, in the last few years, I've moved to a different organization where we work with governments creating information operations in fragile states, in conflicted areas. So we look at reducing people trafficking. We look at improving governance, CSOs, decreasing extremism, that kind of activity. But I do fundamentally believe that there's a lot to learn from the commercial world for that. Like, the commercial world is very good at creating effect. They've been doing it for 100 years and more. They spend about $500 billion a year doing it, so that must be measured. But the most important thing is they have data. And the problem with strategic communications or PSYOPs or any of those things is you can't publish your results. You can't have people looking at the data to see what campaigns work and don't work. But in the commercial world, you can. So it's all driven by money and ego. Everybody writes their report. I have the most effective campaign this year. They submit it, and if they win, they get a trip to Cannes. And so there are people now sitting on huge data sets of what campaigns work and what campaigns don't work. And so I think it's important that we look at those as we try to work out the role for digital. Now, some brands are questioning it. I don't necessarily agree. P&G, Diageo, we're going, are we investing too much in digital? Is targeting working? It will still continue to go up. I'm not here to say it won't. But I think we can look at the role. So the three most interesting people looking at meta-analysis of campaigns are a guy called Professor Byron Sharp from Australia. He's looking at how brands achieve the effect they're looking for. There's a guy called Les Binet in the UK who's looking at what types of campaigns work. And there's a guy called Mark Ritson who's standing on stage swearing at people and telling them to stop messing around with 3D printing and go back and do their day jobs, which is communications. So there's some interesting things going on. They broadly all agree. Emotion drives the greatest response. We saw that this morning in a few of the presentations. That's undeniable. It doesn't really matter between what channel you're using it, whether it's targeted or untargeted. What I think is really interesting is this principle of loyalty. So people thought loyalty existed, and loyalty was a thing, and loyalty was a thing you should leverage. And there was all these bizarre maxims, like 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers. It's not true. It's just not true. And if you look at a sales curve of almost anything, people buy very infrequently, right? There's somebody probably in the United States drinks 30 cans of Coke in a day. There's not many of those people. There's a lot of people buy a can of Coke a week, or a can of Coke a month, or a can of Coke a year. And when you look at that, the aggregate, the people buying very infrequently, are where the money comes from, not the very loyal customers. So what the realization is in the commercial world is you have to talk to everyone. You can't be talking to a few good customers. Your communications have to impact everyone. So I've been thinking about that for my world. As I said, we work in fragile states, conflicted environments, places with hyper-masculine ideals and narratives, places with extreme violence, places with political corruption, places with crumbling political structures. So if I'm looking at a brief or a task that communications can perform, which is to try and decrease radicalization amongst young men, how on earth do I work out who to speak to in this maelstrom of complexity going on in the environment? And the answer is I can't. You know, I cannot work out who to speak to. And it's a bit like selling Coca-Cola. I have to talk to everyone. But there's a good aspect to that. So if you want to encourage, if you want to decrease organized crime preying on the sort of most vulnerable young women in Nigeria who are trafficking them into sex trafficking, you could try and define the women who are looking to move abroad, and you could try and find out who they are. But it's much better to talk to the whole community. Talk to their tribal elders, talk to their relatives, talk to the people they hang out with, talk to the media. And so again, all these projects are looking at talking to collectives rather than individuals. So what I noticed about Donald Trump, and you said this, was he is targeting and he's tailoring and he's gathering information about individuals, but he's doing it on a mass scale. He spent millions. And I think that's what you meant, that Donald Trump knows to keep talking to people and keep talking to people at a large scale while developing that tailoring. So my first appeal is, like, let's not think that micro-targeting means we can talk to small bodies of people. We still need to talk to everyone. We can just do it in new ways. Communications is still a numbers game. You still need to be hitting large bodies of people. So brands know how to operate in this world, and they've worked out that their sole job is to create memory structures. All they want you to do is be slightly more likely to buy a product when you go into a shop because it's slightly more present in your brain. Like, communications is a very weak force, but if they can get, for Coca-Cola, if they can get you to slightly associate it with being a refreshing drink, when you're standing at a cooler, you might be slightly more likely to reach out and grab it. And so that's why all the communications have drips down the side, the clink of the ice, all these things that create those memory structures, because they know that memory isn't a package that goes in your brain, it's a series of connections between different events and different stimulus. It's why a smell can take you back to childhood. It's why music can remind you of your youth. It's because the way the memories are packaged connects with different things, and that's what brands want to do. And the best way of doing that is repetition, by continually reminding. Like, why does McDonald's advertise? Nobody doesn't know who McDonald's is. Why does Coke advertise? Because they need to keep on refreshing those, those memory structures, to make sure those memory structures are implanted, to make sure that when you come to a time to buy something, that you might be there. And the way they do that is by knowing what their narrative is. So they know their narrative, and they call them distinctive assets. So the colors, the brands, the noises, the jingles, the various things that go into that brand and create those memories are their kind of grand narratives. And there's some very good ones. Just Do It. It's worked quite well. I think if a new marketing director arrived and tried to get rid of it, they'd be fired. Because what they need to do is have the consistency of the messaging to create the memories. I'm Loving It works very well. You know, McDonald's. You know, incidentally, you know the do-do-do-do-do, and then it used to say, I'm loving it, and then they dropped that and they just play the jingle. And it's because it's training your brain. So every time you hear that jingle, your brain goes, I'm loving it, I'm loving it, I love McDonald's, I love McDonald's. And it's making those memory structures. So that's the way brands do it. And if you look at the world I'm working in now, like, one of our adversaries is very good at long-term narratives, about grand narratives. If you look at the Daesh press office, everything ladders up to one narrative, and that is the West is on a crusade against Islam. Everything ladders up to that. So they might be targeting people. They do incredible social media engagement. In fact, the guy who used to run Coke out of Dubai was working in the press office. So they're very good at their digital communications. And everything would go back to this narrative of oppression from the West, crusade against Islam. So they know what their big narratives are. And when I look back to Trump again, the Trump election campaign, what I saw was, yes, it was targeted, yes, it was micro-targeted, but Make America Great Again, right? That is part of the left-right narrative. There's two narratives in politics. If you're on the left, you talk about the future. If you're on the right, you talk about the past. It's how it works. Obama, hope. Trump, Make America Great Again. They're even in the UK called conservatism. What is conservation? It's protecting the past. It's what they do. And so the Trump's narrative about make America great again is fundamentally a very long-term narrative that's been embedded in people's minds since before Reagan. So with all of this, it's my kind of second appeal, is while we're looking at micro-targeting and looking at targeting, we need to think about the long term and the long-term narrative and how that embeds its way into culture and how it sits in culture. So we've seen a lot about targeting, and actually there are some successes. I'm interested in looking at empirical evidence about how communications drive effect. Now, there's loads of evidence of brands driving sales or driving actions. It's incredibly good at harvesting up people or exhibiting signs of wanting a BMW or a Uniqlo puffer jacket and funneling them down because they're exhibiting those signs. It's very good at that. Facebook have got some very good evidence about getting voter turnout. They talk an awful lot about how during the election, through a few subtle changes, putting politics up the news feed, changing a few things, I think they changed the politics tab, it increased voter turnout dramatically. What they don't talk about is how they change people from Democrats to Republicans or the vice versa, possibly because they don't have any evidence. And actually, when you look at the slim majority Trump had, and we knew before and we knew during that people said that they were voting for the first time, there is evidence that possibly that is driven by new voters and not by switching. And then finally, when it comes to radical extremism, Google has some very good tactics of if you're exhibiting signs of radicalization, you search for particular content, and it shows you AdWords that will take you off on a hopefully different path. But the point is they all ladder up to something much bigger, and it's all behavioral stuff, and I think that's where the power is within that kind of overarching narrative, is to look at the behaviors within it. You know, you mentioned before demographic targeting is sort of pointless. I'm a 43-year-old man who lives in London. What car do I want? No idea. I actually don't want a car. It was a trick question. But there you go. It didn't know. Whereas behavioral targeting, we can get an awful lot more information about how people are interacting within these larger narratives that need to stay. One thing we haven't touched on is psychographic targeting, which essentially is what Cambridge Analytica's core tool was. Now, it's interesting. What they did do a good job of is psychologically profiling how people make decisions, what people need, what they want, and how they go about it. It's incredibly useful. But the only way they did that is by getting people to go through experiments or tests to determine what personality profile they had. And by buying those, stealing them illegally, using them, they were able to deliver that messaging. I'm yet to see some capability in the real world that allows us to do that without breaking the law. There is some evidence that if you like Hello Kitty, you're more likely to be an open person, and if you like Nicki Minaj, you're more likely to be extroverted. And that comes from that work. But at the minute, I don't think we have the capabilities there. So Bill Gates did say that in the short term, we overestimate the potential of technology, and in the long term, we underestimate it. And I think we're in that period now. I think possibly we're overestimating the capabilities, but I don't deny they're going to come. So I want to end on a hypothesis which is based on no evidence. But I was looking at how politics and the commercial world were slightly divergent in micro-targeting. So politics was all over it, Cambridge Analytica, everyone was all over it. And brands were going, you know, is this really working for us? And so for a while, it was a bleak period, because I started in digital, and it was a bleak period. I thought, you know, brands need to make things. They need to grow. They need to create memory structures. They need to make things in people's minds. But actually, it seemed like politics were just kicking things down. And I was like, please don't tell me that, like, you know, mass-reach communications is about building, and targeted communications is about ruining and destroying things. I've moved on from that. And actually, it was a thing by a guy called Rory Sutherland who talked about the need for social perceptions around brands. So, you know, brands used to exist to give trust, so I believe that that is a good brand. Then in the 80s, it went through this weird choice phase where it was just mammoth brands. And now it's much more about social identity and who you are and what you buy into and the kind of purpose you agree with. And so what Rory talks about is there is a heavily social construct to that. Like if you want to be wearing Beats by Dre, you want to think you look cool, but the only way to do that is to know everyone else thinks they're cool, and other people can't afford them, and they're jealous of them, and they want your headphones, and all this kind of stuff that it does. So what this hypothesis there is that mass-reach media channels are better at making social constructs, because everybody knows everybody else has got the same messages. And so my hypothesis, if you look at alternatively to that, maybe that targeted media is better at more personal decision-making and more personal types of belief systems that you want to change, and more personal issues. Now, they work hand in hand. If you want to get into politics, support of a political party is a fundamentally social act. Voting is very personal. I still don't know what my dad voted his whole life. If you want to be in brands, the desire for a brand is a very social act, but the actual purchase of it is very personal when you start to refine it and do it like this and all that kind of stuff. So I think maybe there is something in that. So to go through, micro-targeting does not mean small audiences. It means big audiences, but tailored. We need consistent, grand, long-term narratives. Let's not walk away from all the things we've learned in the past about how communications work and what sticks in people's brains. Ideally, big, motivating ideas. And then look at digital as a behavioral component or maybe a social, personal component of how they two work hand in hand. I'm not sure, a hypothesis. But I want to leave you with a word of caution about focusing too much on targeting and sort of being really pleased about finding the right audiences and not thinking about the message and what you're trying to achieve. That in the 80s, there was a program in the US called Scared Straight. And what it was designed to do is divert people from a life of crime. And so what they'd find is they'd use behavioral measures to work out who was exhibiting a life of, it looked like they were on a path. They were exhibiting this sort of tendency towards a life of crime, and they did that through police data and all this kind of behavioral stuff, school data. And then they took them through this program where they'd divert them to a new thing. And what they did was they took them into prisons to meet prisoners. The idea being that if you look at a prisoner who's serving 20 years, you'll see how awful it is, and it will divert you from that path. It definitely had no effect, and it might have had the adverse effect. So what was happening is, because we're all optimists, we all believe we're incredibly good at what we do. And so what happened is these young people were going into prisoners, meeting prisoners, going into prisons. They were meeting prisoners and going, well, that guy's an idiot. Of course he got caught. I, on the other hand, am a genius. So I will have a life of crime ahead of me where I'll be successful instead. So it's one thing on targeting versus messaging, and I think the important thing is we hold the two hand in hand and don't walk away from the past too quickly. So I'll leave it there. How am I doing for time? Thanks.